about Lincoln, about the Civil War, but people always have questions about Lincoln, about the war, about movies, about Lincoln, and many other things. So I will be happy to, engage in question and answer when the talk is finished. I don't need to remind all of you that Lincoln is, sort of the most iconic figure in American history. More books have been written about Lincoln than any other American, I believe. And every political tendency, left, right, center, communist, conservative, segregationist, civil rights advocate, have claimed Lincoln as their own. And as I mentioned, of course, as you know, over the past couple of years, Hollywood got into the act with various movies about Lincoln. The Spielberg movie, The Conspirator, Robert Redford, and my personal favorite, actually, Lincoln the Vampire Hunter, which I recommend you to see if you haven't. And you might have seen, there was a movie that came and went pretty quickly called Saving Lincoln, which had to do with Lincoln's relationship with Ward Hill Layman, his pal from Illinois, who he brought to Washington as marshal of the District of Columbia during the Civil War. And I just want to read you this email I got a year or so ago from the people who were making that movie, just to show you all the kind of questions you get asked once people think you know all about Lincoln. So this email says, Dear Professor Foner, our movie Saving Lincoln centers on the relationship between Lincoln and Ward Hill Layman. Layman plays the banjo in several scenes. Did Lincoln play any musical instrument? Specifically the harmonica. We'd love to show the two old friends jamming. With Layman on banjo and Lincoln on harmonica. Does this sound plausible to you? And, my expertise is pretty extensive, but I actually didn't know the answer to that question. I never saw any documentary evidence that Lincoln played the harmonica. So I wrote back to them saying, I really can't confirm this. On the other hand, I say, why not? Go for it. It sounds like a lively scene. It sounds entertaining, and I'm sure it'll be just as accurate as the rest of your movie. I want to talk a little, what I want to talk about tonight actually are, you might almost say, some of the surprises that I ran into. That surprised me when I was working on my book about Lincoln, The Fiery Trial, which came out a couple of years ago now. And I should say, parenthetically, a couple of people have already asked me if I would sign copies of the book. I'm happy to do that if you have it with you, so afterwards, that's fine. I knew a lot about Lincoln. I have taught the Civil War era at Columbia University for many, many, many years. Lincoln, of course, is central to my teaching. I hadn't really written all that much about Lincoln. Most of my scholarship before I wrote this book had either focused on the period before the Civil War or the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. But of course, Lincoln pops up in those books. But anyway, as I say, despite the thousands of books about Lincoln and the immense amount of material that's out there for scholars to consult, I still was surprised by a number of things I ran into. One of the things that surprised me, and that took me a good while to try to figure out, was Lincoln's long advocacy, you might say, of the idea of what they called in the 19th century colonization. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816, and its purpose was to remove the black population of the United States, to either encourage or force African Americans to leave for Liberia, which they set up on the west coast of Africa, or somewhere else, maybe Haiti, or Central America. And although today it seems like a crazy idea, it was a very prominent attitude at that time. The two statesmen that Lincoln most admired, Henry Clay and Thomas Jefferson, were both intense advocates of colonization. Henry Clay was the president of the American Colonization Society for a while. Frederick Douglass, rather uncharitably quipped at one point, he's the president, Clay is the president of the Colonization Society, he's the president of nothing else. His attempt to become president of the United States didn't get that far. Lincoln, for at least 10 years, 1852 to 1862, again and again publicly advocated colonization as the way to eliminate slavery in the United States. Many, many books about Lincoln do not talk about this very much. For example, and I only mention her not because there's anything wrong with her book, but because she's so rich on the basis of it that doesn't matter what I say. Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, very, very successful and popular book about Lincoln and the Civil War and his cabinet. It's probably about 700 pages or something. If you go to the index and look up colonization, you'll find like one sentence in the book. Now, why is that? Is that because Doris doesn't know that Lincoln was advocating? No, she knows that. It's part of the public record. It's not a secret. No, it just doesn't fit the image of the great emancipator. So she leaves it out. But that's not necessarily the best way to write history, to leave out those things which don't fit your notion. It took me a good while to try to figure out why this. And by the way, when Lincoln ran for the Senate in 1858 against Stephen A. Douglas in that great senatorial campaign, he was a member of the board of directors of the Illinois Colonization Society. So this was not just a passing fancy. He was an official of an organization dedicated to colonizing Black Americans. Now, why does this mean Lincoln was pro-slavery? No, of course not. That's absurd. Lincoln hated slavery. It's completely clear from early in his life. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He never claimed to be an abolitionist. He wasn't an abolitionist. The abolitionists, who were in most parts of the North a very small and beleaguered group, they demanded, as you know, the immediate abolition of slavery and incorporating African Americans as equal members of American society. The militant abolitionism of the 1830s, 40s, 50s was to a considerable extent created in order to oppose colonizationism. It was the advent of the Colonization Society which spurred the rise of immediate abolitionism among free blacks and then sympathetic whites in the North. But Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Now, what eventually I came to sort of realize is that colonization can't be viewed in isolation. You can't just say, okay, Lincoln believed in colonization and leave it at that. Colonization was part of a program, a plan to get rid of slavery. We know how slavery ended. This is both the advantage the historian has over people living at the time. We know what happened, and people living at the time don't know what's going to happen. But that is always also a tremendous disadvantage in that, knowing what happened, we have a tendency to create a narrative leading up to that event, a straight line narrative, because we know what happened. So it's very easy to go back and find out the origins of what happened, but that kind of ignores all the other things going on at the time that may not fit into the narrative. Before the Civil War, there were very few ways of thinking of how to get rid of slavery in the United States. First of all, slavery was an immensely powerful institution. There were 4 million slaves in the United States on the eve of the Civil War. That is the largest slave society probably in human history. Maybe there were more slaves in the Roman Empire, I don't know. But 4 million slaves, there was nothing like that in the modern world. The British Empire, when slavery ended there, had about 800,000 slaves. Brazil, Cuba, the other great slave societies didn't have anywhere near the 4 million in the United States. Moreover, slavery was the most powerful economic institution in the United States. It was the foundation of a powerful ruling class in the South that also dominated the national government for most of the period before the Civil War. Most of the presidents up to Lincoln, most of the 15 presidents who preceded Lincoln were Southern slave owners. And those who were not were mostly allied with Southern slave owners. There were a few who weren't, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, but not a heck of a lot of others. How do you get rid of an institution like this, even if you believe that it is immoral, as Lincoln certainly believed? Well, there are various ways. The abolitionists had an answer: moral suasion. Convince slave owners that slavery is wrong, and they will voluntarily give up their slaves. That's a very nice idea. It didn't really happen, though. No, very few slave owners became convinced that slavery was wrong and gave up their slaves. A few did. There were slave owners who manumitted their slaves, but not enough to dent the institution in any way. So that plan didn't get very far. It aroused a lot of people in the North against slavery, but it didn't free a lot of slaves. Then there is political action, or law, legal abolition. That is how slavery ended in the northern states. The emancipation is not something that just happened on one day, like January 1st, 1863. It was a long, long process, and it began maybe with the American Revolution, which spurred the abolition of slavery in the northern states. My own state, New York. How did they do that? Laws were passed for gradual emancipation. Very gradual. In New York, slavery didn't fully end until 1827. Took a long time under those, but nonetheless, that was legal emancipation passed by legislatures and implemented. Now, to do that, you can do that in a state where the slave owners do not have political power. I mean, they have some, but not enough political power to block it. Slave owners in New York or Pennsylvania did not want slavery abolished. They were pretty annoyed, to put it bluntly, that slavery was abolished. But nonetheless, they didn't have the political power to stop it. But in the South, the slave owners had the political power. There was no way you were going to get Southern legislatures to pass laws abolishing slavery. Not likely to happen. Lincoln's idea of colonization was part of a program which really was devised by Henry Clay, his great idol, to try to persuade Southerners to agree to the abolition of slavery. The program consisted of gradual emancipation. It would take place over a long period of time in order to minimize the economic and social disruption. Monetary compensation to the owners. The federal government would pay owners because they're losing property. Slaves are recognized as property, and you just don't abolish property, so monetary compensation would supposedly ease the transition. And then colonization. Colonization was part of this. Why? Because the white South did not want a new large population of free blacks. There were, by the time of the Civil War, somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 free black people in the slave states. That was quite a few, more than in the northern states. But nonetheless, 4 million slaves, and the white South did not want those 4 million slaves to become free members of society. So colonization is a way of saying, okay, we can abolish slavery and you won't face that problem. So eventually I came to realize that whatever one thinks of it as a practical plan, and of course it wasn't very practical, this was part of a policy of trying to get slavery abolished peacefully through the political system and without, major economic and social disruption. And Lincoln put forward this plan over and over again in the 1850s. He first publicly embraced it in 1852 in his eulogy on Henry Clay. When Henry Clay died, today I'm here in Washington, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but politicians tend to be held in low regard by the American audience today, right? I mean, I'll say in New York State, we don't think much of politicians. Probably in most states we don't. But in the 19th century, politicians were great heroes. They were celebrities. People like Andrew Jackson, Lincoln eventually, Henry Clay were idolized by millions of Americans. They were like combinations of a rock star and a sports hero and a movie star, I don't know. And people loved Henry Clay. It's hard to, nobody heard of Henry Clay nowadays. Lincoln loved Henry Clay. Lincoln, he was my ideal of a statesman, he said. His wife loved Henry Clay. His wife's father knew Henry Clay. As a girl, Mary Lincoln had been there when Henry Clay came to dinner at their home. I don't think most people idolize Henry Clay anymore. But so this was in his eulogy on Henry Clay. Lincoln, by the way, was not in office at this time. This is 1852. He was not running for office. He thought his political career was over at that point. So it was not like he was using this for any political purpose. But he prayed. Now, what's interesting is, most of the people who eulogized Clay praised him for what? What was Henry Clay known as? The great compromiser. And today that's not a label most politicians want. The great compromiser. We don't have a lot of those guys in the House of Representatives. No, he had saved the Union, the Missouri Compromise, the nullification crisis, the Compromise of 1850, the Great Compromise. That's not what Lincoln talked about. Lincoln didn't say anything about that in his speech on Henry Clay. Didn't say anything about compromise. He said what was great about Henry Clay was he wanted to get rid of slavery, which is true. He tried for decades to get Kentucky to pass this plan of gradual emancipation with no success. But Lincoln failed to mention that Clay accomplished absolutely nothing in his 50 years of advocacy. But I guess in a eulogy, you don't mention that. So, and he praised particularly the colonization. He said that colonization, Clay realized that is the way to get rid of slavery. And that's the greatness of Henry Clay. He understood how to get rid of slavery in this country. Once Lincoln goes back into politics, 1854, you know the story of Lincoln in the 1850s, he keeps talking about this. All right. So eventually I came to realize that you can't just isolate that. This is part of a plan to, not a plan that worked to get rid of slavery. Now there is another way to get rid of slavery. And that is how slavery is eventually abolished. And that is military emancipation. Military. That does not require the consent of slave owners. You see, the plan of gradual emancipation, compensation, colonization tries to get the consent of owners to the end of slavery. Military emancipation does not require the consent of owners. It is just decreed as a military measure. This is what the Emancipation Proclamation was, as you all know. It is a military order. It's not a law. It's not passed by Congress. It's not a constitutional amendment. It is a military order, premised on military necessity, as Lincoln says in it, and justified constitutionally by what we call the war power of the president. It's issued as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States as a measure to help win the Civil War. Now, this was not the first time in American history that military emancipation had been promulgated. People were well aware that this was an option. The first Emancipation Proclamation in America was issued not by Lincoln, but in 1775, I guess, by Lord Dunmore, the British colonial governor of Virginia. The colonists were getting riled up in Virginia, as you all know. They were at war by then with the British. Dunmore, who didn't have a lot of troops at his disposal, said, looky here, any slave of a rebel, a patriot, who comes to the British side and joins my forces will be free. I'm freeing them. Why did Dunmore do that? Was Dunmore an abolitionist? No. He needed men, and he wanted to weaken the other side. Freeing the slaves of the other side in order to weaken them was a well-known tactic in wars of the late 18th and early 19th century. In the Caribbean, the British offered freedom to French slaves. The Spanish offered freedom to British slaves. The French offered freedom. You always offer freedom to the slaves of the other side to weaken them. This was known. It was completely normal to do that. The American government had done that. In the Seminole War, the Second Seminole War, in the late 1830s, early 1840s down in Florida, you know, the Floridians were annoyed because slaves, or the Georgians, had slaves escape from Georgia to seek refuge among the Seminole Indians, who gave them refuge, sort of enslaved some of them or whatever. But anyway, these fugitives fought alongside the Seminole against the American Army. The U.S. Army commander down there, I can't remember his name, said, all right, we're getting tired of this. If you guys will agree to leave and go out to Oklahoma, we'll recognize the freedom of these slaves. We'll recognize their freedom. They ran away. They're not free. They're slaves. The Georgians were pretty annoyed about this. What do you mean the Army is going to recognize the freedom of those who run? They're supposed to get them back to us. But for military reasons, the Army said, well, if we don't want to fight anymore, take your freedom and go to Oklahoma. So the Army recognized the freedom of these slaves for military reasons. So nothing new about this. But this is what the Emancipation Proclamation is. And what the Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, I'm sure comes after 2 years of Lincoln, or a year and a half of Lincoln, first putting forward his original plan. In the fall of 1861, he brings it to Delaware, one of the 4 border slave states that remains in the Union. Delaware had only 1,800 slaves. Not a heck of a lot. Lincoln calls in the congressmen and some leaders from Delaware, and he says, look, we're going to get emancipation going here, and Delaware can lead the way in this. Delaware will have the honor of leading the way in emancipation. Anybody from Delaware? It's a small place. Well, Delaware blew it. Delaware refused. They said, forget it, Lincoln, we're not interested. We want our slaves. We're not interested in your plan. Lincoln was undeterred. He brought it to Kentucky. He kept bringing it to the border states. He asked Congress to pass a constitutional amendments authorizing the government to pay for the slaves in the South and colonize them outside the country. That was Lincoln's plan for the first year, at least, of the Civil War. But it didn't go anywhere. The slave owners, even in the loyal border states, did not want it, and African Americans didn't want it either. Most of them were strongly opposed to the idea of colonization. They insisted that they were deserving of their rights as American citizens, not to be sent to somewhere else. Lincoln met, famously or infamously with a group of blacks from Washington and said, I really think you ought to go out and propagandize among your people to emigrate to Central America. He had a place in mind there. They said, forget it, Lincoln, we're not leaving. So the second thing that surprised me in a way was how the Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally differed from Lincoln's previous views or policies about slavery. It's completely different. It is immediate, not gradual, takes effect right away. There was nothing in the Emancipation Proclamation about compensation. Lincoln just liquidates the largest concentration of property in the United States. The slaves as property were the largest concentration. Slaves as property were worth more than the banks, factories, and railroads all put together. And that property is just absolutely abolished with no compensation. Quite a radical act in the social history of the United States, or even the world. No compensation whatsoever to the owners. And thirdly, the proclamation says nothing about colonization. Lincoln drops the idea of colonization with the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, the proclamation is premised on the idea that these emancipated slaves are going to remain in the United States. First of all, for the first time, it authorizes the Army to enroll black soldiers. Putting black men in the Army is a very different concept than telling them they have to leave the country. And secondly, Lincoln, another thing that surprised me in thinking about the proclamation was that you've got to read the Emancipation Proclamation very carefully to really fathom what's at the heart of it. Everybody knows the proclamation. I'm sure everybody in this room has seen it on paper or maybe the real thing at the National Archives. But read it really carefully. Now, it's hard to do because it's really boring. Really boring. Military orders are boring. It's not like the Declaration of Independence. It does not start with a glorious statement of the rights of mankind. You know, all men are created equal. No, not in there. The natural right to freedom, not in there. The only moral sentiment, so to speak, in the proclamation is at the very, very end, inserted by Lincoln at the suggestion of Secretary Chase, Secretary of the Treasury Chase, where he says, you know, this proclamation believed to be an act of justice, issued on military necessity and believed to be an act of justice. Act of justice is the only moral sense. But nonetheless, if you persevere and read it, you will benefit, because Lincoln addresses the slaves directly in the proclamation. It's not just an order to the Army, or that's what most of it is. He addresses the slaves directly as members of American society for the first time. In the preliminary, you know, in September of '62, he had issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, warning the South that they don't give up, we're going to free your slaves. When that was issued, he had said, some people had complained that, and the Southerners got very alarmed about this, that this was an invitation to, you know, racial warfare in the South, to a slave uprising, to massacre all the white people, things like this. And then Lincoln should tell them to not do anything like that. So in the final proclamation, he says, I enjoin upon these freed people to abstain from violence. Abstain from violence. Okay. Now, he could have left it at that, but he didn't. He said, abstain from violence except in necessary self-defense. That's very interesting. These freed people have a right to defend their freedom with violence if necessary. Lincoln was not cowed by those who said, oh no, it's going to be a giant massacre, you've got to keep these people under control. No, they are free people now, and they have a right to defend their freedom by whatever means are necessary. And then he goes on to say, I urge you to go to work for reasonable wages. First of all, go to work here in the United States, not somewhere else. Go to work here as a laboring class. What struck me reading it was the word reasonable. He didn't just say go to work for wages. Go to work for reasonable wages. And you know, Lincoln is a very, very careful writer. Lincoln didn't put words in, you know, just inadvertently, without thinking about that. The word reasonable is in there. These former slaves have a right to judge the reasonableness of the wages they are being offered, and they do not have to accept unreasonable wages. In other words, he's treating them as people with volition, with agency, who have a right to judge their own situation. And this is a complete change from what any American president had ever said about black people in the United States. He's now addressing them as people whose loyalty the Union has to earn. They're now part of the American picture, the American society. So it's not just enough to just say, okay, you're free. He goes further than that, and as I say, that's why the proclamation, I think, bears really careful reading, that he understands that now these, you know, you can't just take for granted that these 4 million slaves are now going to suddenly all rally to the Union side. You've got to encourage them or persuade them to do that. And finally, I was also surprised by what I consider the very rapid evolution of Lincoln's attitudes about black people in America in the last 2 years of the war, the last 2 years of his life. As I said, before the Civil War, Lincoln shared many of the prejudices of his society. There was no question about that. It is absurd, although some books do this, to make Lincoln, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. from the day he was born. That's not Lincoln. Much more interesting is, I think, the trajectory of growth that Lincoln goes through. One of the things that did surprise me was Lincoln was the first American president to actually meet with black people in the White House. I'm not talking about slaves. There are plenty of slaves working in the White House. I'm talking about black people as members of America, as citizens, members of American society. Everybody knows he met a couple of times with Frederick Douglass. Sometimes that is blown way out of proportion. You know, the reporters call me, tell me about the relationship between Douglass and, there was no relationship. Now, they knew about each other, they admired each other, but they met twice. And then at the second inaugural, Douglass shook his hand. But nonetheless, they did have very important exchanges. But Lincoln met with a lot of black leaders, not just Frederick Douglass. He met with Martin Delany, he met with Sojourner Truth, he met with Bishop Payne of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He met with delegations of blacks from North Carolina, from New Orleans. He met with Alexander Crummell. He toed up. And I think those meetings, I think two things galvanized Lincoln's very rapid evolution of his racial views. One, just his encounter with these politically active, articulate, intelligent black people, because he didn't know any such people in Illinois. There were hardly any blacks in Illinois when Lincoln was living there. He knew his barber was an African American. There were a couple of black women who worked in their house, but these were not political figures. And I think meeting people like Douglass and others really expanded Lincoln's horizons in thinking about the capacities of African American people. And then also just the service of black soldiers in the Civil War. By the end of the war, something like 200,000 black men had served in the Army and Navy, and Lincoln came to believe that their service was indispensable to Union victory. The Union would not win the war without the service of black soldiers. In fact, Karen mentioned this symposium coming on about the election of the presidential election of 1864. And one of the papers about what would have happened if Lincoln had canceled the election, which isn't really history, but it's interesting to speculate, of course. But what's interesting to me is not what would have happened, but what did happen, or what didn't happen. In this sense, in August 1864, when Union casualties were enormous after the Virginia campaigns, and there was a lot of war weariness in the North, and many people, including Lincoln himself, figured that Lincoln was going to lose the presidential election. You know, he made his cabinet sign that famous document he wrote about the fact that it was likely he was going to lose. Henry Raymond, the editor of the New York Times and the head of the Republican National Committee, came down to Washington at the end of August and said, hey, Lincoln, you're going to lose, man. And the Republican Party is kind of alarmed about this because all those other Republicans don't want to lose also. And he said, you know, what you got to do, and why are you going to lose? You're going to lose because people think the Emancipation Proclamation is prolonging the war. They're tired of the war, and they think that the war will never end as long as you insist that slavery also end. Why don't you offer to the South to come back with slavery? Rescind the proclamation. Maybe they'll probably say no, but at least the onus will be off you then. And Lincoln thought about it. He actually discussed it with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass came in for his second meeting with Lincoln right at that time. And eventually Lincoln said, no, I can't do that. I cannot do that. Why? Well, first of all, it would be completely immoral to promise people freedom and then rescind the promise of freedom. I would be damned in time and eternity, he said, to do that. But second of all, he said, if I do that, the black soldiers will lay down their arms. Why should the black soldiers fight if we betray our promise of freedom? And without them, we cannot win the war. So the service of black soldiers has, in a sense, provided the underpinning for the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln cannot rescind it because he would lose the black soldiers. That's what he said. And their service propelled Lincoln to think about blacks in a new way in society. And as you probably know, in his last speech, in his final speech before his assassination, for the first time publicly, he said that he thought that some African-American men, women couldn't vote anywhere at this time, some African-American men should have the right to vote in the reconstruction of the South. Who? Which ones? Well, he said what he called the very intelligent, and this was, he was talking about Louisiana primarily, the sort of free black, educated property, free black population of Louisiana. But he also said, and those who serve our cause as soldiers. The soldiers have earned the right to vote in the reunited nation. No American president had ever said that any black person deserved the right to vote. Lincoln himself had never said that publicly, although privately he had done some things along those lines vis-a-vis Louisiana. At that time, only 5 northern states allowed any black men to vote. Illinois did, Ohio did, Pennsylvania did, New York basically did. There's such a high property qualification for blacks that almost none could vote. So Lincoln, by this point, is way ahead of the curve in terms of northern public sentiment about the citizenship rights of African Americans. And so that was really my, not surprise exactly, but I came away from this project of studying Lincoln with this great admiration for Lincoln's capacity for growth, capacity to change. Not being caught and stuck within an old framework in a crisis which put a premium on new thinking, on forward-looking thinking, on being able to cast off old ideas and old prejudices. And I think personally that that is a much more interesting and in a way more admirable view of Lincoln, that he did not start out where he ended up, but to see how he evolved and changed, then the more common view in much of the literature that he was born with a pen in his hand, and he was ready to sign the Emancipation Proclamation as soon as the time was right. That is ridiculous, of course. And I think that's what we can learn from Lincoln. And maybe our politicians today, I'm not talking about any particular party, would have a greater public esteem if they also have this flexibility and this capacity for growth and capacity for change and being willing to update their views to deal with the crises that are at hand in our modern society. So thank you very much for listening, and as I said, I'd be delighted to answer questions for a while.
You mentioned the British allowed the blacks to join their forces. The British lost the war. What did they do with those people that joined?
That's a very good question.
About how many joined them?
The American Revolution. Yeah, this is one of the things about the American Revolution. One of the things that my students will tell you, and I will prove now, is that I always answer questions by telling a story. So you have to indulge me here. My wife and I have a little house, we go in the summer, in northwestern Connecticut. Back some 10 years ago or so, our congresswoman then, Nancy Johnson, called me up and said, you're my constituent, and I have a plan to put up I want to put up a monument in Washington to the black soldiers who fought in the American Revolution. There's no monument. I said, that's a great idea, Congresswoman. But, here's my idea, I said. I think you should put a monument to those who fought on both sides. Some of them fought for the Americans, and some of them, more actually, fought for the British, because they were both seeking their freedom. She said, "You're telling me we should build a monument to the people who fought on the other side?" No, Congress doesn't do that sort of thing. We don't put up a monument to the other side. When the British occupied New York City, which they did for the whole war, and then later on Charleston, Savannah, tens of thousands of slaves sought freedom from British lines. And by the way, later, Lord Dunmore's proclamation was expanded in the so-called Phillipsburg Proclamation by, I think, Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander in North America in 1779, that any slave who ran away to the British would become free. You didn't have to join the army. That included women, children, anybody. Dunmore said anyone who fights for me will become free. Clinton said, not anybody who comes over. Slaves of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson ran away and got their freedom from the British. So what happens? Good question. When the British evacuated after the war, they lost, some number, still under debate, of African American, of former slaves went with them. We know 3,000 left from New York City because the commander there was Clinton, kept what he called a book of Negroes. He kept a record of every single slave who was taken away, and he presented that to Washington. Washington was upright. Washington was annoyed. Washington wanted the British to get back some of his slaves, and Clinton said, forget that. It would be dishonorable to offer people freedom, and then, so, but I'll make a list. Here it is. And he gave him a list of 3,000 slaves. It's now online, digitalized. Some number left from the South, from Charleston, Savannah, maybe all told 20,000, something like that, gained their freedom from the British. Now, many more were recaptured or were left behind. I don't want to make the British into total humanitarians. I give Clinton credit for not being willing to go back on his thing. But more African Americans gained their freedom because of the British than because of the American patriots in the Revolution. That is certainly clear. So that shows you how our nation was founded on a kind of a contradiction from the very, very beginning. We were fighting for liberty, but one of the liberties we were fighting for was the right to own slaves, the freedom to own slaves. So, and a lot of those slaves who did go with the British ended up in Nova Scotia, ended up in Britain, and many of them ended up in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa, which was established later in the 1780s as a refuge for them. So there are some books on this. It's an interesting story. Yes, in the back. Can you stand so we can hear better? Yes.
Sure. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the transition in the Southern mentality in their attitude towards slavery from, 1787, as I understand, the majority of Southerners voted for the Northwest Ordinance. 1820, a majority voted for the Missouri Compromise. By the 1840s and 50s, their outlook, their mentality completely changed. They wanted slavery almost everywhere in new territories. I understand the economics that strengthened or that kept slavery in place. But what was it that actually changed that view from being a necessary?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and it's a complicated story, obviously. I think at the time of the Revolution, and in fact for much of the period up to the Civil War, and indeed into the Civil War, there was a pretty significant difference of outlook between the upper and lower South. The Jeffersonian Virginia and Maryland, a place like that, there was always a kind of a vague idea of getting rid of slavery somehow. The notion, what they said was it was a necessary evil. They didn't defend it as something good, but it was there. But, Jefferson himself was always mulling over this. Jefferson is a kind of tortured soul, You read his private writings, very, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people ought to be free, or I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. And, many of the Virginians were thinking about some way of getting rid of, and even, in 1831, the Virginia legislature debated getting rid of slavery. In Maryland, more of the black population was free than slave on the eve of the Civil War. But the Deep South was always adamantly for slavery. At the Constitutional Convention, South Carolina and Georgia, they insisted, the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave, they would not sign a constitution without deep protections for slavery built in. Well, Declaration of Independence. Jefferson included in the original draft, a little bit dishonestly, the Declaration of Independence, I said it's a marvelous document, the first part. The rest of it is what we call in New York, kvetching. It's just a long series of kvetches against King George III. He's done this, he's done that. I mean, in New York, we understand everyone's complains all the time. Oh, George III, he did this, he did this, he did this. What a lowlife, George III. It's actually kind of embarrassing, actually, as the founding document of a great nation. But one of the things that Jefferson stuck in there was George III has sort of imposed slavery on us because Virginia tried to limit the importation of slaves, and the British government vetoed that. But George III was not responsible for slavery, I'm sorry. Virginia planters had something to do with it too. But anyway, but that's not in the final version because South Carolina and Georgia said, hey, we're not signing something like that. We're not signing anything that makes slavery look in any way bad, negative, critical, etc. So out it goes. If you've ever seen the musical 1776, there's a song about this. Not historically accurate, but kind of musical. So there was always this division, and as the economy, now many in Virginia thought that slavery was sort of going to die out because Virginia's agricultural economy at that time was shifting from tobacco to grain, which didn't need as much labor. But once you get the cotton gin and the tremendous expansion of cotton production in the lower South, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, the defense of slavery becomes more and more intense. By the Missouri Compromise, even people like Jefferson, as I say, Jefferson is opposed to restricting he writes the Northwest Ordinance, which prevents slavery from going into Ohio and those places. By the Missouri, he's opposed to preventing slavery from spreading westward. Why? He comes up with a cockamamie idea called diffusion. Spread slavery and it'll just sort of disappear. I mean, Jefferson was smart enough to know that was absurd, completely absurd. But nonetheless, he could not figure out a way of dealing with the institution of slavery. So, and then the rise of the abolitionist movement is critical. The frontal attack on slavery in the 1830s leads to a vigorous defense. There's no need to defend something that's not under attack. Once it's under attack, a whole pro-slavery argument emerges, which claims slavery is, good for blacks, good for whites. It's better that slaves are treated better than working men in the North or in England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's religious arguments, biblical arguments, you name it. So the South becomes more and more closed in mentally in the defense of slavery. It becomes more and more difficult to criticize. Although William Freeling shows this in his books on this period, in Virginia, anti-slavery sentiment survives all the way to the Civil War. But south of Virginia, you're not going to find much of it by the 1840s and 50s. All right, that's a very short, I'm not so short, but that's a simple explanation of something that's actually probably even much more complicated than that. But it is an important trajectory of some of the thinking, absolutely. Yes, in the back.
I was fortunate enough to go with the Lincoln group to the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And as a proud Southern boy, there really is something beautiful about July 3rd. But I also, as a proud American, know that it's a rebirth of freedom. And to your talk, Lincoln essentially ignoring what Tawney had to say, takes blacks and turns them from slaves into Americans. At the commemoration, one of the most moving moments was with the new citizens who were brought to our country. And our Justice Scalia chose to give a really brief talk on the subject of the un-American, which I felt was a bit odd. And I wonder if you'd speak to that. How did Lincoln feel about un-American.
What do you mean by un-Americans? You mean
You'd have to ask Justice
immigrants?
Scalia.
I think Scalia is thinking of the McCarthy period.
The first thing I thought too was
Who are the un-Americans we're talking about here? Immigrants, is it?
Say that again. This was at the commemoration, and he spoke very briefly before he swore in the new citizens.
Yeah, well,
And he
I'm
spoke
glad it
over-
was brief because he seems to be going down the wrong path. No, look, Justice Scalia is an eminent jurist. He's not known as a historian. And a little learning is a dangerous thing, as we used to say. So I honestly don't, I have no idea what he was talking about, which is how I often feel when I read his but I don't know. But it's the question of whether African Americans were American was hotly debated at that time. The Dred Scott decision had firmly declared that no black person can be a citizen of the United States. That's what the Constitution only is for white people, it said, and that's it. No black citizenship. The Lincoln administration repudiated that. But before the proclamation, in the fall of 1862, Attorney General Edward Baines had issued this ruling saying, no, free black people born here are citizens of the United States, in a sense rejecting the Dred Scott decision. And then Lincoln, by the end of the war, as I say, was talking about some blacks voting. So the growing acceptance of the notion of African Americans as Americans, we may say, well, that's obvious, but it wasn't obvious at that time. In fact, in his Peoria speech, in his great Peoria speech of 1854, where Lincoln, reemerges onto the political stage as a critic of the expansion of slavery, in that speech, Lincoln says, so I don't have the exact words in front of me, but he says, if all power were given to me, I would not know what to do about slavery. My first impulse would be to free the slaves and return them to their native land, Africa. In other words, he sees them as an alien element in the society. Their native land is Africa. They are not really Americans. They have been picked up, subjected to a terrible injustice, should become free, but he doesn't see them as part of the society at that moment. Now, of course, the fact is Africa was not the native land of the vast majority of African Americans. The slave trade to the United States basically ended in 1770. It picked up again a little bit in the 1780s and a little bit again in South Carolina, 1803 to 1807. But the vast majority of black people were born in this country, and in fact their grandparents had been born in this country when the Civil War broke out. So they were not Africans. They were people who, any more than Lincoln was an Englishman. But that notion that they were not really part of the society was very hard to break out of. And the Civil War is part of that process of, and again, once you serve in the army, it stakes a claim, so to speak, to membership in the society. So I'm not sure what Scalia was going after there, but the notion of who is an American, who is really an American, was hotly debated then, as it is today, absolutely. Yes,
yeah. Like you talked about how the strategy of emancipating an enemy slave was a good strategy. When you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, on one hand,
wait, say that again. What about that strategy?
emancipation of slaves
Right.
and the enemy, was a
Yeah.
good strategy. So if you look at the Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln, and you look at it on one hand as a moral proclamation, that this is the moral basis of the Civil War and so forth. On the other hand, it's a strategic proclamation.
Yeah.
The military, we're going to get more black soldiers to do this.
Right.
So, where is the balance?
Well, it's all of the above. It's one of those things. Most major policy enactments have multiple origins and multiple causes. Lincoln always said that he made a distinction between his personal view which he was consistent all the way through his career, his personal view that slavery is just wrong, and his, in a sense, role as an office holder, whether it's a member of Congress or president, having to operate within the laws, within the Constitution, within the political system. So even though he says slavery is wrong, that doesn't mean he can just go ahead and do anything he wants about it. So you know, I think there's a balance there. The proclamation stretches the Constitution, so to speak, to the breaking point, or may even go beyond the Constitution. Really, the people who wrote the Constitution, I think, did not envision a time when the president would use the war power to just abolish slavery. On the other hand, they also didn't envision a time when 11 states would wage war against the rest of the nation. So the Constitution was just not applicable in some ways to the situation that actually confronted the country at that time. But I think Lincoln was a lawyer, Lincoln was a politician, Lincoln was a guy who works within the political system. And so that is, you know, he tried, and he's very concerned that the proclamation withstand legal challenge if it's ever going to come. You know, he doesn't want the Supreme Court or other courts declaring it unconstitutional in some regard. He said to Chase, this is the only legal basis I can do this on. But nonetheless, his personal moral belief is the basis of wanting to do it. I mean, if some other way, if Breckinridge had been elected, or Douglas, had been elected, or Bell had been elected president in 1860, none of them would have issued an Emancipation Proclamation because none of them had this anti-slavery sentiment to begin with. So it's just a combination of personal belief, political action. I mean, the proclamation is a political document as well as a military one. For example, as you all know, it does not apply to the entire Confederacy. It exempts certain areas of the Confederacy, southern Louisiana, eastern Virginia, and the entire state of Tennessee. The entire state of Tennessee is exempted. Why? Because Andrew Johnson, the military governor of Tennessee, begged Lincoln to exempt Tennessee because he was trying to build up a pro-union government in Tennessee, and he said it will help us if we don't have emancipation right now. So Lincoln exempted it on the grounds that, well, the Union Army's in control in these areas. It was in control in eastern Virginia, but it was certainly not in control of the whole state of Tennessee. That's ridiculous. But nonetheless, so it's political. Lincoln wanted to encourage the growth of pro-union governments within the Confederacy, so he sacrifices, in a sense, the slaves of Tennessee for the time being to that purpose. So all these things go into the Emancipation Proclamation. It would be wrong to just say it's a moral act, or purely a military act, or purely a political act. It's all of those things at the same time. In the back, yeah.
I would like to start with something you said earlier tonight about how many people have written books about Lincoln, and tell you that your book dealing with Lincoln's travel from personal views on slavery until the emancipation, that tortured trip. You made something clear that all those other people did. They may not have that as goal. But I think you achieved that goal well beyond reasonable expectations. Having tossed your guard, let me now toss your challenge. No, historians don't like anti-factuals. But if we can assume that Lincoln was not assassinated, and that the war ended, as we know it did, except for Lincoln was president, do you believe that Lincoln would have had the ability, I'm not asking what his policies would have been, to get his policies on the issue of slavery and Reconstruction and so forth through that somewhat fractious and problematic Congress? would Lincoln have been successful in implementing what he thought was the final solution to slavery?
You mean if he had not been assassinated?
Yes.
Well, that of course is a question that is frequently thought of. And we don't know the answer to that. Lincoln was a very savvy and successful political leader. He also worked quite well with Congress, you know. I mean, Lincoln only vetoed a couple of things in the Civil War. And he, even though the Republican Party had factions, radical Republicans, moderate Republicans, in the end, every single thing that Congress passed about slavery, Lincoln signed, with the exception of the Wade-Davis bill of 1864, which he pocket vetoed. You know, the problem of Reconstruction was immense. It would have taxed the ability of any man, even as great as Lincoln. But I think it's certainly fair to assume that Lincoln would have had more success than his successor, Andrew Johnson, who is a top candidate for the label of worst president in American history. Johnson lacked all of the elements of greatness of Lincoln. He was totally inflexible, stubborn, unwilling to listen to criticism, deeply, deeply racist, out of touch with Northern public sentiment, just the wrong man for the job, unable to work with Congress. I think if Lincoln had lived, what would have probably happened is what happened in 1866. In other words, I think Lincoln and Congress would have worked out some kind of plan on Reconstruction, which would have probably looked something like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, maybe the 14th Amendment, partial black suffrage maybe. The radical Reconstruction, whether one thinks it was a good or a bad idea, to some extent arose out of the impasse with Johnson. It was the crisis with Johnson that was the creative element in the situation, pushing Congress in more radical directions. Without that, it wouldn't have gone as far. Now, what the result of that would have been is impossible to say, and how white Southerners would have responded, whether with violence as they did or in other ways, nobody knows. So, you know, it's good, it's interesting to speculate. The one thing I think is, Reconstruction is surrounded by an immense set of layers of mythology, which, even though historians have debunked them for a long time, they're still very, very known and, you know, widely shared in the public. And one of the biggest myths is that Lincoln had a plan of Reconstruction, as if Lincoln had not been shot, he would have just been doing the same thing he had said in 1863 or 1864. That is not Lincoln. The idea that Lincoln was fixed and would never have changed his mind on anything is ridiculous. That's not how he operated. So you can't freeze Lincoln at the point of, let's say, his proclamation of Reconstruction of December 1863 and say that's what Lincoln would have done after the Civil War. We don't know what he would have done, but I think we do know that he would have displayed many of the same qualities of flexibility and compromise he had during the Civil War. So would it have worked? I have no idea. But I certainly think his successor was a heck of a lot more, you know, it was a disaster among American presidents. Let's see, let's see, there may be one more question and then we will, all right, go ahead, and then we'll call it a day, okay?
Yes, a couple weeks ago they had the downtown market, they were selling old Macs, and I noticed they had one of Africa, and they had a spot shadow on Liberia.
Stand up and speak louder.
Why don't you stand up?
Yes, a couple weeks ago, a friend of mine bought a map from him that was an old map of Africa, and they had a spot shadow on Liberia. And in Liberia they had it cut up, and there was a part that had Maryland on it. And I know that one of the editors of the Freedom's Journal went on to be governor of the Maryland part of Liberia. You mentioned that Lincoln met with Mark Delaney, who advocated colonization. Douglas was, of course,
Right, Delaney advocated immigration, yes.
So can you talk about Lincoln's relationship with black folks who advocated colonization?
Well, you know, Delaney is an interesting guy because he was, before the Civil War, a abolitionist, a black abolitionist. In 1850 or 51, I think it was, he enrolled in Harvard Medical School. And basically, all the other students resigned. Now, it was probably small, maybe 10 or 12 students. The other students, the white students, resigned, withdrew, because they didn't want to have a black student. The president of Harvard said, all right, tough, we'll educate Delaney. The trustees said, wait a minute here. These guys are paying tuition. Delaney is only one guy. Forget this. Delaney is out and the white students are back in. Delaney was annoyed about this. And he moved in the next year or two toward this emigration. In fact, he explored in the late 1850s. He went on an exploration of the Niger Delta. He was the first American to actually penetrate the Niger inland of the great Niger River in West Africa, looking for a homeland for black Americans. When the Civil War breaks out, he forgets about immigration, and he actually enrolls in the Union Army when black troops are allowed in, and he becomes one of the very, very few commissioned officers in the Army at the very end of the war. So Delaney goes, and like many people, nobody is, their views change as the circumstances change. When he thought there was no hope of equality for black people in this country, he believed in immigration. During the war, he dropped immigration because he thought that things were changing and slavery was under attack, etc. After the war, he's involved in Reconstruction. After that, he gets involved in immigration again, after the end of Reconstruction. So it's a complicated story, but, I don't think Lincoln discussed all this when he met with Delaney. He was talking about Delaney's role in the Union Army, as an officer. But it's just part of this complicated story we see. All right, anyway, thank you all, thank you, Karen, and
the Lincoln Group would like to award Eric with our 2013 Lincoln Award.
thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
Okay, the evening's not over yet. Susan and Bernie have been passing around raffle tickets. One of our members, Carol Van Dusen, has kindly agreed to give away something special. And so I'm going to call Carol up here so you can explain.
Actually, I'm going to ask Eric to come back down here. Eric and I have met before.
Yes, we are.
In Columbus, Ohio, where I am from.
Right.
And Eric, when we last met, I gave you this.
Yes, you did.
And you are the only individual that I've ever given it to.
This is great. This is the letter of Lincoln, or a facsimile of the letter by Lincoln to Horace Greeley, the famous letter in August 1862. Right?
Correct. Yes.
That's fabulous. That's great.
And the reason why I have it is that my great-grandfather was the editor that Lincoln gave the letter to. And it was reproduced in facsimile in his publication in 1880. He wrote an article about the Emancipation Proclamation and included this actual 3-page letter within the publication. The original letter today is at the Wadsworth Athenaeum.
Is that right?
Yes. And it was given by my family. And the gift letter that we received when we gave the letter is going to be included. So I've got reproductions.
This is great.
This is just a prototype, actually. I have archival prints that will be available starting in 2013. And if you're interested, see me outside.
All right.
Okay.
So,
I have 5 reproductions,
right.
and some 5 lucky people are going to take these home.
That's very We're gonna pick out the,
So everyone should have a ticket. If anybody didn't get a ticket, raise your hand and I'll make sure you get one. No? Okay.
one ticket per person.
You want the
Okay.
first one?
All right. Number, okay, 491908. 491908. Someone needs to read it up. Next one. Yes.
There you are.
And my card is included
Congratulations.
with that, so you can contact me at any point for questions or further information about it. Okay, next number is 1059247. 1059247.
There you are. Congratulations. He's presenting his ticket just to make, we
Yes.
trust him.
Yes. We'll talk.
Good work.
Neil, nice comment.
Okay, 491922.
Hey.
Hooray.
That table. You sure the first one? All right, good work.
One 1059214. 1059214.
Everybody has this?
14.
I've got 4-1.
10592. Oh, excuse me, that is not a 1, it's a 7.
Oh,
74.
7-4 are the last
Yep.
two digits.
274. Yeah, sure. Reading glasses. 1059274.
Yeah, that's mine. I'll take it.
Great.
Definitely want this as a history teacher.
Good. Hopefully it will be accessible on Library of Congress website to be so prints and available. So stay tuned. Okay, 491899. 4918.
Yep. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very generous. Here you go.
Thank you very much.
I have to just say one thing in terms of facsimiles of great historical documents. I've been the last day or two over at another hotel at the conference of the American Historical Association. And one of my friends was telling me that she was in Charleston at a shop, and they had a sort of a souvenir, which was an old marriage license of Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara. And she asked how much it cost, and the woman said, well, it's only $20 because it's not the original.
Guys, it was a wonderful evening. Great way to start the new year. For those of you who are not members of the Lincoln Group, please join. As you can see, we have a wonderful family. We try to stay active, and we're just a great group. Okay, I'm not kind of prejudiced, but we are a great group. So I'm going to leave you with a story that Lincoln may or may not have told. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you. Lincoln was walking down the street one day, and this gentleman walked up to him and pulled out a gun to shoot Lincoln. And Lincoln, of quite amazed, looked at him and said, "Sir, why do you want to shoot me?" And the man said, "I always swore that if I found somebody uglier than myself, I'd shoot him." And Lincoln rubbed his chin and contemplated for a minute. He said, "Sir, if indeed I am uglier than you, please shoot me." And the gentleman, he was so astounded from Lincoln's response that he put the gun in his pocket and walked away. So I want to leave you with a little laugh, and please have a great evening, safe travel home, and hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Whether she's still